Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Let me know how I sound. Please let me know how I sound. I have my headphones here because we are going to listen to one or two things. It's going to be a slower stream today, probably. I don't generally come on at this time, but I really wanted to make up what I missed yesterday. I had announced I was going on yesterday, and then just a lot of things happened. There's a lot going on during the day. It was hard to set up and prepare. And then I rescheduled with uh, Kim Iverson, and that should be coming out today on her channel. Just waiting for the notification about it. So that should be good. That was an hour-long conversation yesterday to edit what had been technical issues. So yeah, it's all about Xinjiang and propaganda. And although Kim and I don't have the same politics, but we do have an agreement on this issue of war and peace. So it was a really good conversation, and I thought that I was able to really get in what I feel like is important about that issue. So that's exciting. And I love doing collabs like that where it really does feel like the priorities are straight. So, with that said, though, guys, uh, like this video as you're coming in, it'll be a slower one. I'll contemplate whether to keep it up or maybe just clip it up and give the stream to my Patreon subscribers at the end. I might start doing that for the slower videos. But yeah, I'm gonna let people get settled. I'm gonna say hello to people in the chat. I'm gonna actually just fix something real quick while you're waiting. Make sure you're liking the video, hitting that like button, and hitting the subscribe button, notifications bell, etc., etc. Of course, the best place to support me is on Patreon or Substack. You can find both of those links in the description of this video, or you can find it in the channel art, the channel banner. My link tree is also there now. I've made some changes to that. So I'm just going to go and say hello to those who are here. Hello, Emma. Thank you for the sound check. Hi, Alex. Hello, Big Teal. Good to see you again. Hi, Shaniqua. And yes, hello, Where? Hi, hi, hi. All right. So yeah, we're gonna take a chill. I've been adjusting to a new schedule. My wife works overnights now, so I'm all thrown off. I feel like I'm going to sleep later. My dog doesn't understand that, so he's waking up at the same time, 6:30. And oftentimes I'm a light sleeper. Like I can't. My wife is very lucky. She's someone who can just go to bed, and if she's woken up, she's oftentimes able to just go back. But I've never been like that, so I've been adjusting. I'm a little tired. I'll try to pick up the energy as we go along. Hello, Guberwala. Hello, Anthony. Yeah, so like the video as you're coming in, and do all that good stuff. Share it wherever you can, and yeah, hit the subscribe button. I'm close to 20,000 subscribers. I'm less than 50 away. I believe I'm close to 40 subscribers away on YouTube from 20,000, which is a huge milestone. I mean, it wasn't it wasn't a year ago where I had less than half of that. So we've been making some pretty good growth here. Klimbatis, thanks for coming. Don't worry about it. Share it if you can before you go, and I appreciate all of your support. Yeah, so what I'll do, I have a few topics I want to cover, and then if there's time, I'm hoping, this will end around 2 p.m. Eastern. I'm hoping that if there's time, I didn't get any new Patreon questions, and if you would like, please do either through a super chat or maybe persistence when I get there. If there are no super chats, you can put your question in the chat when we get to the end of the program, and then I'll answer, because Usually I do that for Patreon subscribers only, but if there are none, I'm willing to take those who are just here. If there's a super chat, I'll probably prioritize those. All right, guys. All right. So today I have a few topics I want to get through. One, I want to talk about the 1-year anniversary of the United States' withdrawal from Afghanistan. We're going to watch a video from the cradle kind of summarizing the 20 years of formal occupation. And then what's the legacy now, right? How has that developed since then, since the haphazard, disastrous so-called withdrawal from Afghanistan last year around this time? I believe it was August 15th. I also want to, I'm going to go over that. I wanted to have a CGTN article ready. I submitted it. It's something I was working on, but now I'm told closer to the end of the month. So I don't have that to reference, but there are a few instances, I wanted to compare some recent developments around what the United States is doing around the world, what actually existing imperialism looks like versus how maybe how China has been perceived around the world, and how what China is doing, because today it has been announced that China will be forgiving the debts of 17 African countries. And we know that China has been called imperialist. But I want to make just a really basic comparison so you have an understanding. So that's another story. And then a Taiwan update. And then I want to go over my Substack article, because there is one update with Taiwan. It's in the economic realm. I believe this is where, on top of the aggression, we're going to really see the United States ramp things up and create what I think is going to be an intense amount of blowback, both on Taiwan's local economy as well as, how the United States behaves in this way. It's really interesting what's happening, and it's all about trying to economically isolate China. A very foolhardy effort, but nonetheless, that's where we are. So, without further ado, why why not get into this? And uh, I'm just gonna say, hey, Connie, good to see you. Yeah, it has been a while. So good to see you back here. So yeah, we got a little bit of a slower stream today, but no worries. I might just, depending on how this thing grows, I may just keep the full stream to Patreon subscribers for this one, and then clip up the video at some other time. All right, the U.S. legacy in Afghanistan. So the United States supposedly withdrew from Afghanistan August 15, 2021, after the Taliban had essentially taken the country back. It had been making steady gains since around 2018. There was a so-called peace agreement signed in Qatar by the Trump administration with a commitment to withdraw all of the troops to basically end the war in Afghanistan. The backlash to that by the ruling class was incredibly intense, and there was no indication whether Biden would follow that or not. And it wasn't until the Taliban had essentially forced Biden's hand that the Biden administration immediately withdrew. And that was because actually the Taliban had made such progress that there were U.S. forces dying. Right, a lot of the damage that happened afterward was the United States' military forces essentially uh, uh, responding in a very heavy-handed, in a really disgusting way. You might remember the drone strike that happened during this so-called withdrawal that killed, I believe it was 7 children. So, the war crimes during the withdrawal alone are just so condemnable. But there's a lot more to this, as you know. I mean, this was a 20-year-long formal occupation, and that hasn't necessarily ended, right? The U.S. occupation may not be uh, uh, as large and may not have the same number of troops, but we know just from the United States' bombing drone strike on al-Zawahri, the uh, terrorist Al Qaeda affiliate. Um, we know from his death that the United States very much has a presence there. And we know a lot of it has to do with the way the United States wages war at this time, which is different. It's the United States wages what Barack Obama called smart wars, or what he opposed was dumb wars or rash war. That's what he literally said in 2002 at an anti-war rally. He said, "I'm not here to be anti-war. I'm here to oppose dumb war and rash war, but I'm for smart wars." And what that means is that the character of war changes, but the damage done necessarily doesn't, right? The damage that this new form of warfare, or we could call it a reformed kind of warfare, doesn't do any less damage. And we're going to get into exactly how much damage has been done to the people of Afghanistan, because it's been just a huge war crime. The United States has committed so many war crimes in Afghanistan alone that every U.S. president since George W. Bush should be at The Hague right now being convicted for them, because there really is no trial to be had. The trial has basically already been conducted in the sense that these are unquestionable atrocities. They have been well documented, and we are going to get we are going to get into it. So first, let's go over a summary, okay? We're going to go over a summary from the cradle of the war, the U.S. war on Afghanistan, the U.S. invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. So you remember this invasion began in 2001 as a response to the 9/11 attacks, although many people like to claim that this invasion was justified because you could prove that the so-called terrorists, those terrorists that not bombed, that drove planes into the World Trade Center, stemmed from Afghanistan. We know better now, right? We know more so about Saudi Arabia's role, Israel's role, the United States' role in help creating the conditions for this. So the invasion of Afghanistan was not about terrorism. It was about resources, minerals. Afghanistan is one of the most mineral-rich countries in the world, with lithium and all sorts of other very precious rare earth minerals that are needed for the tech industry. It also is a key staple in the energy industry, and it also is a key country in the opium trade, the trade of opium, which, as you know from the Golden Triangle, Afghanistan has played a central role in the production of the poppy that eventually makes its way into the rest of the world and has created in the United States an incredible opioid addiction crisis, right? Not just from the medications, but also the illicit forms of use that then people rely on when either they can't get pain medications or whether they just become addicted for other reasons. We know that the Golden Triangle, the corridor that Afghanistan serves as, with these huge poppy fields that are actually protected by the U.S. military. We know that this has a lot to do with what's going on with the opioid addiction crisis. So Afghanistan plays a lot of different roles. And then, of course, if you can securitize, militarize Afghanistan, you have a foothold in a very resource-rich region that borders China as well as Russia. So it's an incredibly geostrategic country as well, right? And so I want to now get into the summary, right, of what happened. So I'm gonna put my headphones on. So yeah, the cradle, which Pepe Escobar, who's been on the program, friend of the show, he writes and contributes a lot. We're going to get into a Twitter summary that they posted, which I thought was helpful because it's very brief and we can kind of get a sense of this war here we go. We can get a sense of the broad sort of developments from this war over the last 20 years. So here we go. Here it is. It says, 1 year after the liberation. Can I close this? Okay. Hold on one second. I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I'm, hold on one second. Okay. So I don't know why my Twitter is being so buggy. Okay, well, I'm just going to share now. So sorry about that. All right, we're going to get into the summary. Let's do this. All right, here we go. 1 year after the liberation of Kabul, the Cradle reviews the war in Afghanistan, covering 20 years of occupation and carnage. Oof, I am not on my game today, guys. Bear with me. All right, here we go. This is the timeline, okay? This gets a broad sense of what happened during the war in Afghanistan.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
I can report to the American people and to the world that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda. America's combat mission will be over by the end of this year. Starting next year, the Afghans will be fully responsible for securing their country.
The moment a bomb went off in the Afghan parliament building in Kabul on Monday morning.
President Trump ordering a drawdown of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan by January the 15th, just 5 days before he's set to leave office.
Refugees he has promised to bring to Canada. But the Liberal leader was unable to provide a plan for how or when they would get out.
After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces.
So there you have it. There you have a very basic summary. And I think the casualties are very, very important because this is well documented. The Cost of War project at Brown University has documented just how gruesome the United States' war was on the civilian population. I mean, you saw that. 40,000+ people that we know of, plus 50,000 more so-called militants and fighters. And we know the line between those things is very, very, very small and thin, meaning that we know that the United States, we know that even international organizations trying to differentiate are not the most reliable sources in that. So we know that the civilian casualties are very high. Comparably, you saw those numbers from contractors, 3,000, the United States, a couple thousand, NATO countries, because remember, this was a NATO war, a little over 1,000. So essentially what we're talking about is a casualty rate of 10 times higher for the people of Afghanistan. This was a siege. This was an occupation. This was a war of aggression that killed 10 times, probably more, many more times more than that when it comes to the ratio between the Afghan people and the invading forces, the imperialist invading forces. So, I mean, that's war criminality. That's war crimes. We know how devastating that ratio is when you're talking about just the human experience, when you're talking about what it's like to have that happen to you. It's terrorism. It's traumatic. It is a war of aggression. That is the U.S. legacy of its occupation, right? That is a legacy of the United States when it comes to the occupation of Afghanistan. And we know that there's a lot more to this as well. You saw Ahmed Karzai, during his reign, just absolute total corruption. He was in the CIA's pockets. He was double dealing, and the Afghan economy was just impoverished to the point of humanitarian crisis. The people of Afghanistan are still suffering that crisis too, because the United States has increased and escalated an economic siege, has actually shifted somewhat, because we know that the military element is still there. You have contractors still on the ground, right, which are really just mercenaries, really just armed hirelings of the military state that are for profit. We know that. But the economic siege is something that is not new, but it is dramatically escalated with new components to it. So let's talk about this part of the legacy, because I think it's very important. Then we can go into broadly what the war on Afghanistan really meant in terms of its global significance. So the Cradle also did a great article on a very short summary on the theft of Afghanistan's foreign reserves. So this is the asymmetric warfare. This is the non-conventional warfare. This is the economic warfare that the United States has been waging against Afghanistan. And so this was published on August 15th, the 1-year anniversary when Joe Biden announced, because some of you may not know, that directly after the so-called withdrawal from Afghanistan, the United States seized $7 billion of Afghanistan's central bank assets in foreign reserves, which essentially bankrupted the country, and the impact is still being felt today, and we're going to see how and why. So on the first anniversary of Taliban's victory against the U.S.-trained army, Washington unilaterally decided to keep $7 billion of Afghanistan's foreign reserves. So the government of U.S. President Joe Biden has decided not to return Afghanistan's foreign reserves and suspended talks with Taliban officials over the issue. Quote, "We do not see the recapitalization of the Afghan central bank as a near-term option," U.S. Special Representative of Afghanistan Thomas West told the Wall Street Journal on the 15th of August, exactly 1 year after the Taliban took control. Quote, "We do not have the confidence that the institution has the safeguards and monitoring in place to manage the assets responsibly." I mean, can you just think about what they are saying in public? The U.S. administration, the Biden administration, is telling the U.S. public, is telling the world that it has the right to steal from Afghanistan's central bank, steal literally $7 billion in a poor country. That is an incredibly high amount of money for the GDP, the per capita GDP, and the overall GDP of Afghanistan, which is one of the smallest, poorest countries in the world, despite being one of the richest in resources. To say outright that they do not have any plans on giving back the money, nor do they believe that the money will be used responsibly. So that means the United States is going to use that money responsibly. And that means that what they're indicating is that the United States is the only responsible arbiter. This is imperialist hubris of the highest order. So the decision is allegedly related to the U.S. drone strike that killed al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul last month. Quote, "Needless to say, the Taliban sheltering of al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri reinforces deep concerns we have regarding the diversion of funds to terrorist groups," end quote, West told the Journal. So yeah, it's all about terrorism. The war on terror never ended. The war on terror never ended just because we're in great power competition, new Cold War, just because the United States has more targets than it did during the war on terror in terms of its overall imperialist strategy, doesn't mean that the war on terror ever ended. The war on terror was always a war of terror. It was always just a justification to enhance and expand imperialist aggression into this particular region. Never had to do with terrorism, because the United States literally, the Taliban is literally a spawn of the Mujahideen, which the United States is responsible for spawning and also funding and arming and then keeping around after their role of defeating the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1970s and 80s was over. They were allowed, they had essentially gained such a foothold that the United States basically established the presence of terrorism in this country and in this region. But no one ever talks about it like that. At least very few people. Following the botched withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan last year, Washington froze $7 billion of the country's foreign reserves. Officials then decided to earmark half of the funds to pay the families of victims of 9/11 attacks. Now, that is such a ploy to divert the funds to Americans who supposedly are victims of 9/11, when in fact September 11th has way more to do with imperialist destabilization of the region led by the United States than has anything to do with Afghanistan. So basically, the United States says it has the right to punish all of Afghanistan, the Afghan people, the Afghan government, and then steal their resources, diverting them to Americans. This is just theft from Afghanistan to the United States, right? So the United States doesn't even have it has neither the moral compass nor does it have the political will to just pay and support families who lost tragically during 9/11. Doesn't even have the ability to do that. It steals. It doesn't have to do this. This is what it chooses to do. This is what the U.S. ruling class chooses to do. Steals from Afghanistan and says, ooh, here's how we can get around actually using U.S. government funds, actually helping people through government policy. We can steal from Afghanistan and then give them that money. And then it's all settled. And it looks like we're the good guys. But, I mean, this is just absolutely criminal. Another $2 billion of Afghanistan's funds have been frozen by other countries. So that means they've lost $9 billion. So it's not just $2 billion. And you know that other $2 billion that have been frozen by NATO countries, you know that those countries are doing it at the behest of the United States. So it's both morally, 70 economists and experts delivered a letter to the White House which says it is both morally condemnable and politically and economically reckless to impose collective punishment on entire people for the actions of a government they did not choose. The loss of its foreign reserves has pushed Afghanistan into an acute humanitarian crisis as a central bank lacks resources to combat high inflation and help the populace on the brink of starvation. And so Save the Children, which, you know, I won't endorse this NGO, but Save the Children says that 97% of Afghanistan's families are struggling to provide enough food for their children, while almost 80% of their children are going to bed hungry. So people are starving in Afghanistan. Just like in Yemen, where the United States has backed Saudi Arabia's criminal invasion, its imperialist invasion that has caused mass displacement and mass death, premature death, and just mass murder of people in Yemen. The same now is happening in Afghanistan. The economic siege is creating a massive tidal wave of hunger. People are starving. Joe Biden is starving children. This is Joe Biden's policy. He's the commander in chief. And this is something he has publicly supported, this freezing of Afghanistan's assets. Other NGOs are sounding the alarm, with both Doctors Without Borders and Action Against Hunger denouncing the spiraling crisis. The international sanctions have a terrible effect on the Afghan population, says Sami Ghuseibi, regional director of AAH, told France 24. The only way out of this crisis is to allow the economy to get going again. The only way for that to happen is to allow foreign investment to flow into Afghanistan. Last month, lawmakers in Washington voted to bar Afghanistan from receiving any U.S. humanitarian relief as part of a bill that approved an unprecedented $839 billion to the military. So there you bar Afghanistan from receiving any relief from the United States. So the United States destroyed Afghanistan. It bombed infrastructure. It killed more than 50,000 people, nearly 100,000 if you count the so-called fighters, which unclear whether you can just call those folks you don't know. A lot of people took up arms with the Taliban. That was just the truth. That was happening for years under the Obama administration. We were getting reports that people were picking up arms with the Taliban because they were the only force strong enough, organized enough to resist the occupation. So a lot of people, ordinary people, likely died in that 50,000+ number of so-called militants. So after killing nearly 100,000 people, after destroying Afghanistan's economy, destabilizing the country, the United States is now saying that it will not provide any humanitarian relief, which, to be honest, the United States doesn't know the definition of that word. Of course, we know that NGOs and so-called humanitarian relief is generally used as a weapon of imperialism, but this is an even further escalation of cruelty. I mean, this is mass collective torture that the United States is imposing on the people of Afghanistan, and that's how it should be looked at. That's because that's what's happening. Mass collective torture on the people of Afghanistan via economic means. And then it says, besides stealing Afghanistan's reserves, Washington has also washed its hands of several war crimes committed by U.S. troops during the pullout of Afghanistan last year. And it links to another Cradle article, which talks about how, and I'm not going to show that per se, but just what they're referencing here is a few things. They're referencing that the Pentagon, that the United States killed dozens and dozens of people, and that there was also that drone strike, which was very significant in that it killed, I think, like 6 or 7 children, and I think 12 or 15 overall, with like 7 to 8 of those being children. So the United States washed its hands of literally war crimes as it was leaving. So the United States couldn't just leave. The United States had to kill people, maim people, and massacre people as it was leaving. At least leaving in the formal sense, right? Getting a lot of its formal military personnel, its so-called, military forces, and keeping the military contractors, mercenaries, etc., logistics, intelligence, that they aren't gone. We know that because the drone strike hit Ayman al-Zawahiri. that's not what a withdrawal really looks like. It means get the hell out of the country. You're no longer allowed to be here. Yankee, go home. That's not what happened. That is not what happened in Afghanistan. So the United States maintains a neo-colonial arrangement in terms of its militarism and its political influence, because we know that the United States is trying to both politically influence the Taliban and undermine their rule, regardless of what you think of the Taliban. That is what's happening. And they're doing so primarily via economic means, collective punishment on all of the people of Afghanistan. So this model, guys, and this I think is a really important thing to remember about the legacy of the United States in Afghanistan. This model is not something that's necessarily new. We saw with Iraq, Barack Obama withdrew the formal military forces in 2011, but kept a lot of so-called informal special operations forces in Iraq, thousands of them after 2011, sent more troops back during the so-called fight against ISIS at the latter end of his administration, and also conducted its own kind of asymmetric economic warfare on Iraq. I mean, this isn't new. The people of Iraq have been suffering this since 2011, since the formal end of the U.S.'s invasion there. And many people have died of drone strikes, of military operations, more covert, of the so-called counter-terror operations, so-called coalition military operations. The wars don't end. The United States doesn't know how to end wars, because if the United States were to fully withdraw from a place like Afghanistan and Iraq, it would lose a massive amount of influence very, 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 very fast, because the appetite for the United States' presence militarily in that region overall is very small. It is not a popular endeavor, endless war, right? It doesn't win the hearts and minds of the people. And so, this is not new. Iraq is just one example, though. I mean, this kind of warfare is happening everywhere. We saw how the United States, how Barack Obama, and then the subsequent administrations, Trump and Biden, have waged war on Syria, for example. And we're going to get into how there are some very stark parallels to the way that the United States is waging war now in Afghanistan to how it's waging war on Syria. We can just get into that right now, actually. And again, it's the Cradle, because I found some really great resources from the Cradle. And so economic siege is not necessarily new. It's, it's something that the United States is waging against dozens upon dozens of countries, nearly 40, and it does so in many different ways. Sanctions are just one way, but sanctions are an important way. The United States right now has Caesar sanctions on I'm trying to find this article now. Where is it? Oh no, it's a Twitter post. Where is it? So there it is. Okay. The Caesar sanctions in Syria were incredibly and have been incredibly damaging to Syria. I mean, it has tanked the economy. Syria has been in an economic depression since the Caesar sanctions were instituted a few years ago, right? These sanctions have just devastated the country, but it's not just sanctions. The United States steals resources outright. It plunders resources to those countries it wages war against. And Syria is probably the most blatant example. It's not done covertly. We're not talking about how the IMF does things, how Western corporations all over the world, multinationals, the United States with the biggest. It's not just about how those countries use debt, use loans, use their ability to come into countries and so-called invest when really all they're doing is stealing resources. This is the United States being caught stealing oil out of Raqqa, Syria. So you know that in I think it's northeastern Syria, right? 30% of the country is occupied by the United States. The United States is occupying Syria militarily, and it's stealing their oil while it's doing this. So the U.S. Army has been looting the country's oil and smuggling it into their Iraq bases, stealing over 80% of Syria's oil output per day. This is economic warfare of the highest order. This is collective punishment and torture. And here you see the convoys, right? You see the convoys stealing the oil, literally a traffic jam of convoys from Syria's oil reserves in Raqqa, taking it away to Iraq, to their bases, so that Syria can be starved of its own oil resources. This is just criminal. This is imperialism. This is what imperialism really is. Imperialism is outright theft. You have a traffic jam coming out of Raqqa, Syria, out of US-occupied Syria, going to Iraq, smuggling it over the borders, stealing 80% of Syria's oil output per day. And we're talking about other countries committing war crimes. We're talking about China or Russia being imperialists, when you have the United States committing the most heinous crimes against humanity. That's the US's legacy in Afghanistan, perfecting the most dangerous, violent, and criminal imperialist system that has ever existed to date. That is really the legacy, because we know from Syria, we know from Libya, we know about how NATO, through its deployment and its coalition, as they called it, helping the occupation of Afghanistan, helping the US's occupation of Afghanistan, we know how NATO has been able to expand beyond its so-called jurisdiction, like it has any. But even if we just think about the North Atlantic, NATO really crossed. I mean, Yugoslavia was a cross in 99. But Afghanistan, that's West Asia. That is not the North Atlantic. So we know the consequences when it comes to NATO expansion and how NATO has been used as a tool of war to fuel the US's aggressive endeavors in places like Afghanistan. And then, of course, as we've seen over and over again, other places like Libya, Syria, Ukraine now, on and on and on. NATO had been emboldened by the war on terror just as much as any other aspect of the US's military apparatus. And then, of course, the economic warfare and sanctions now on Afghanistan as a way to kind of shift the theater of war has been used in so many other places. It's now being used against Russia in regard to Ukraine. The United States has 38 other countries sanctioned as well. As it militarizes Africa, it sanctions Eritrea, for example, and Zimbabwe. As the United States figures out how to reinforce the Monroe Doctrine and create military and political instability in Latin America, it has placed sanctions on Nicaragua, on Venezuela, right? There's no part of the world where the United States hasn't imposed these kind of sanctions for its political and military objectives. The same with China, right? The United States sanctions China's tech industry, sanctions certain industries in China, China's solar industry, as it's militarizing the region to contain China. So really, the legacy of the United States in Afghanistan now has morphed from outright occupation, theft, and plunder to a more broadened kind of siege that includes economic warfare as a way to balance out both the public relations needs of the empire as well as the fact that the United States has absolutely no capacity to keep up the same kind of occupation that it had been, that economically it was a drag on the United States. And now this is going to turn more into a proxy war, a war of de facto occupation, and a war to essentially keep Afghanistan as poor and weak as possible so that other geopolitical objectives can be served. And so this is the last thing I want to say about the direct legacy in Afghanistan is that the United States now is looking at Afghanistan as a key cog in containing both Russia and China, because we know that Afghanistan shares borders with both. So if you can keep Afghanistan weak, perhaps you can keep the Eurasian Economic Union weak and the Belt and Road Initiative weak. I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. I also think that there's a high likelihood that the Taliban government is going to get closer with China and Russia over the next few years. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be effective, but I think there's already immense pressure with this economic warfare to keep China and Russia away and from these incredibly valuable resources that Afghanistan is sitting on top of. It has ostensibly the right to independently do what they want with them. So I want to now move on to talk about, right, because I talked about this economic siege of Afghanistan. $7 billion worth of frozen assets. We know that several $1 billion worth of assets to Venezuela have been robbed from Venezuela's foreign reserves, right? This is not something that's just particular to Afghanistan. The United States does this everywhere it can. But we often hear that China is the imperialist country, right? And before we get into the Taiwan update, I want to talk about what happened in the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, which was underway this week. And there were several very important announcements that give us an idea of which country is practicing imperialism and which isn't. All right. You have the United States stealing right out from under Afghanistan, literally plundering its resources. And then you have China doing something differently. So, you would think that China, if it were an imperialist country, would have every interest in just plundering the resources of the African continent, right? That Africa is maybe the most resource-rich region. I mean, look, a lot of the global south, especially in Asia and Africa, are incredibly wealthy in terms of resources, so natural resources. So it's hard to compare. But we know that Africa has just an incredible amount of natural resources that can be used for industrialization and for production. And that's why the United States and the West continue to plunder it and keep Africa from being able to develop its own economies. But China Daily did a summary of the FOCAC conference. I don't necessarily have to go through word by word, but close ties are reaffirmed, consensus on key issues reached, and Foreign Minister Wang Yi gave a press conference on this. And so it says China and Africa have reaffirmed their commitment to building community with a shared future in the new era to enhance fruitful cooperation and add fresh impetus to global development and stability. It was a coordinators meeting on the implementation of the follow-up on actions of the 8th Ministerial Conference of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation held via video link. So this is a follow-up. This meeting happened earlier this year. So some of the things that were talked about in terms of multilateral cooperation, synergizing the Belt and Road Initiative and Global Development Initiative with the African Union's Agenda 2063. And here's the big thing, though. So Wang Yi, who's a foreign minister of China, he said China is going to waive 23 interest-free loans for 17 African countries that had matured by the end of 2021, and over $3 billion has been delivered out of $10 billion in credit facilities that China pledged to African financial institutions, and nearly $2.5 billion loans were channeled to Africa's priority programs, he said, adding that China's import of African goods within 7 months reached $70.6 billion, and Chinese companies had invested $2.17 billion in Africa. To help Africa fight COVID-19, China has provided 889 million doses of vaccines to 27 African countries. So those numbers alone should give pause to anyone who says China is behaving like an imperialist country in Africa. Imperialist countries don't give money to African financial institutions. When have you heard of France, the UK, the United States putting money into African financial institutions? We know that 14 African states, West African states, still have their currencies being dominated by France, right? France literally controls from the so-called mother country, the colonial mother country, still controls the currencies of 14 African states. I've never heard of the reverse being true. So China is literally giving money to African financial institutions and channeling money into real investment. China itself has invested $2.17 billion, but this is big. This is big because what it means to import goods, all right? And this is just a 101 for those who need to understand economics and imperialism, is that generally what imperialism likes to do, what Western imperialism has done over the course of centuries, but especially in the post World War II era, is it's used international finance to ensure that African countries and poor, formerly colonized countries can't actually develop the industrial capacity to become a country that can export out goods that can then lead to the ability to make up for whatever you're unable to produce, right? So it creates huge imbalances in the economy. What the United States and the West has loved is for multinational corporations to get privilege through their debt arrangements. And then those multinational corporations essentially say African countries can produce X, Y, and Z and nothing else. Usually one industry, usually one, if it's agriculture, one crop, right? Palm oil crops, right? The palm trees, like that kind of thing. Whatever it is, right? There's no diversity, there's no ability for African countries to meet the needs of people because this kind of mode of production is neocolonial. It only serves the interests of the foreign power, the Western imperialist power. Now, China, now it's not common for then the imperialist countries to say, okay, we're just going to import we're going to import those raw materials that you're producing for these. No, that's not how it works, right? It's not goods, right? It's not the manufacturing capacity is very low. So China is not only investing in African countries' ability to create a manufacturing base, which then it can use to develop the countries to have a higher standard of living. But it's also importing the goods that result from this, meaning that it's win-win because China can import goods that it needs and African countries can develop economies that are mature enough to develop things like a working class, to develop the capacity to have certain kinds of infrastructure, to have human needs met, and to build roads, that kind of thing. Usually we don't hear imperialist countries saying, yeah, we've plundered your resources. We're making it now in other places. We're making the products that these resources are going to be used in other places around the world, but we're going to import your goods. It doesn't really happen like that. That's a part of this imbalance that the US and Western imperialists like to have with their neocolonial, with their neocolonial arrangements, right? They like that. They like African countries to be suffering from this. So, I mean, who's the real imperialist, right? Who's the real imperialist? Is it China doing this kind of business in Africa? Or is it the United States and the West, which is literally stealing from Afghanistan and has done nothing like what China is doing, which is putting investment, money, resources into African institutions around the continent? That's fundamentally different, in my opinion, than literally stripping African countries of their ability to manage their own currencies, like France has. So there's also the fact that the United States is militarizing the African continent and China is not militarizing the African continent. Okay? There was just news that came out a couple days ago, August 17th, that the United States is killing Somalians, is killing Somali people. The U.S. airstrike killed 13 militants. They always say militants. So drone strikes are happening, right? These were supposedly reduced and nearly ended by the Biden administration, but they haven't ended. And so a U.S. airstrike killed an estimated 13 al-Shabaab militants in Somalia on Sunday, according to a U.S. Africa Command news release Wednesday. The airstrike is a seventh such attack against the Islamic militant group confirmed by AFRICOM in 2022. So there's been 7 of these. All but one of this year's strikes have been launched since May, when President Biden authorized the military to deploy hundreds of special operation forces to Somalia. So there's been a market escalation. I don't know if you remember, but drone strikes had actually tamped down since the Trump administration as Biden has has attempted to shift priorities. But since restarting something that Trump ended, which was special operations forces in Somalia, these attacks have gone up 6 since May. Biden's order reversed Donald Trump's late presidential withdrawal of counterinsurgency forces. The United States launched Sunday's airstrike in coordination with the federal government of Somalia, the fragile central government that is at war with al-Shabaab. The targets were militants who were actively attacking Somali National Army forces near the village of Tidan, nearly 200 miles north of Mogadishu, according to the news release. Sunday's attacks brings the number of al-Shabaab fighters killed in U.S. airstrikes this year to an estimated 27. It comes just days after an airstrike on August 9th left a presumed 4 al-Shabaab fighters dead. Presumed. So there's a lot of presumption here. I mean, when it comes to the way the United States treats Somalia, just like any other country, it's waging the so-called war on terror. The line between militants and civilians is thin. But AFRICOM is reporting no civilian deaths resulting from airstrikes this year, including Sunday's attack. But in 2020, human rights groups accused AFRICOM of not reporting civilian deaths from its airstrikes. So they don't report it. This is gangsterism. This is imperialist gangsterism. China doesn't do this. You can't find one shred of evidence that China has used drone strikes on African countries or drone strikes on any country for that matter, that China has done any kind of action like this. Nothing like what's happened with Afghanistan, nothing like what's happening on the African continent. I mean, there's no comparison. And so people who want to say, oh, well, China's bad too. China's just as bad, is not looking at the facts of the situation. To me, it is of the utmost insult to the intelligence of the human race, to the intelligence of oppressed people, to the intelligence of the movement that we need and the people within it, to claim that something that hasn't been proven, like all the claims about Xinjiang, to claim that China is doing things that have not even been documented once, or if they have been documented at all, it is not reliable, and it's just, again, a bunch of claims versus what's actually happening in the world today. One of the things that empire does, that imperialism does, is it creates a fantasy world. It creates such a stark level of alienation that people literally begin seeing the world through the eyes of fantasy, of myth making, of mythology, right? American exceptionalism is the most dastardly and dangerous form of this mythology because it makes that mythology feel real. It makes this idea become real, right? And when ideology becomes reality, it means that we are operating on a metaphysical, idealistic plane that moves people in directions at the behest of certain class interests. In this case, the military-industrial complex, Wall Street, the overall capitalist ruling class, so heavily invested and indebted to a war machine that it needs to keep its predominance, to keep its dominance over the planet. That's what the war in Afghanistan was about. World, global domination for the 1%, for capital, at the expense of Afghanistan and the rest of the world. And that's continuing by different means now, with, of course, a smattering of what had been happening, because the United States never ends anything, because the policies embedded in imperialism cannot reform themselves out of existence. They have to be ended by the force of the people, by people who force them to end and create something new. That's why anti-imperialism is a revolutionary principle, a revolutionary outlook that inherently goes together with socialism, because you cannot transform the state without transforming the economy, and vice versa. You can't have one without the other. And so a revolution presumes that you need to wrestle hold of that ready-made state and do things differently before you can change the economy, and vice versa. So so that's the legacy of the United States in Afghanistan. With that said, everyone, I want to talk about a Taiwan update, okay? And so the United States, of course, I don't think I've been on since Ed Markey's Senate delegation. So Ed Markey took 4 other Congress people. This guy's a fraud. He's always been a fraud. So-called progressive Ed Markey took 4 other Congress members to Taiwan recently, just 12 days after Nancy Pelosi's trip. So that was August 14th. And of course, they did the same thing as Nancy Pelosi. They met with stakeholders. They met with Tsai Ing-wen, the so-called president of Taiwan Authority. So after that happened, an announcement happened from the trade representative of the United States, Catherine Tai. And I want to read what they said, because this is about economics. Of course, war is always about economics. War is not just for some kind of abstract domination. The economic realm is the principal contradiction under imperialism, because imperialism is outgrowth of capitalism. So on August 17th, after this trip, the United States announced formal negotiations on a US-Taiwan initiative on 21st century trade. Under the auspices of the American Institute in Taiwan, which is the fraudulent, so-called informal embassy, the informal embassy, because you're not allowed to have a U.S. embassy in Taiwan because it's not a country, but nonetheless, that's what the American Institute of Taiwan is. in the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States have reached a consensus on negotiating mandate for the US-Taiwan Initiative on 21st century trade announced on June 1st, 2022. The negotiating mandate announced today sets out broad objectives of the two-sided upcoming trade negotiations. It's expected that the first round of negotiations will take place this fall. Today, we begin negotiations with Taiwan under the auspices, blah, 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 for innovation, yada, yada, yada. So the Deputy United States Representative Sarah Bianchi said, we plan to pursue ambitious schedule for achieving high standard commitments and meaningful outcomes covering the 11 trade areas, negotiating a mandate that will help build a fairer, more prosperous, and resilient 21st century economy. So that's not informal cooperation. That is literally attempting state-to-state economic relations with China's sovereign territory. So, of course, China is not happy about this. And there's a big reason why it's not happy about this that we're going to get into. I want to first share with you an article about China's response to these ambitious plans. Beijing reacts. So RT says a senior Chinese official accused Taiwan of colluding with external forces. It said that a spokesperson for China's Taiwan Affairs Office, Miao Xiaogang, responded to an American statement on trade talks with Taipei issued earlier this week, saying, quote, we urge the U.S. to abide by the One China principle and the three Sino-U.S. joint communiques with concrete actions. Attempts to play the Taiwan card to prevent China's reunification and national rejuvenation will not succeed. Adding that Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party had colluded with external forces, betrayed the interests of the people on the island, and sought political self-interest. And it came less than 24 hours after the Office of the Trade Representative released a document outlining an ambitious roadmap for the talks and that they were going to begin this fall. So here's what the United States really wants out of this. And I'm just going to talk about this. Because not only do you have the military escalations from direct violations of the One China policy, but you have something interesting economically happening. Ed Markey's delegation, Nancy Pelosi's trip, these trips to Taiwan all had the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation, TMSC, which produces the bulk of the entire semiconductor industry that exists in the world. They all met with this huge giant, right? And the whole point is this, and it's going to be disastrous for Taiwan, and it's not going to work out the way I think the United States hopes it will. But what the United States wants out of Taiwan is this, and this will be the principal ask in these negotiations, because I put that in quotes because Taiwan is essentially being cultivated as a neo-colonial puppet regime within a territory that is not a country. So that's very complicated. But in a sense, the United States is playing with fire and attempting a neo-colonial arrangement in something that I think is unprecedented, right? Violating another country's territorial integrity and sovereignty in the process. But I want to just mention that the big ask for Taiwan is for it to move its manufacturing, both its manufacturing hub. It wants Taiwan to export that manufacturing to the United States, to come up with arrangements that allows for some level of outsourcing to the U.S., which, if you've seen inflation these days, you can sense that might be a disaster. But that's why the CHIPS Act was passed for all these subsidies. So what the United States is going to say is, we have these subsidies. Do you want to cash in, come and try to produce in the United States and stop trading with China, stop doing business in China, because China also has favorable terms for companies, Taiwan production, to do business in China, right? So that's often not talked about a lot. You probably remember Foxconn, that's a Taiwan-based corporation. They did a lot of production in China where there was the controversies about working conditions during that period, the early 2000s. Now a lot of things have changed. Standards are higher, labor laws enforced better now over the years in China. But nonetheless, still a lot of production happens, right? There's a big trade relationship that China has with Taiwan, and it's so robust that it includes production. And so the US is going to ask Taiwan, wink, wink, ask, right? It's going to say, no, we have these subsidies now. We have this CHIPS Act. We want you to cut that off. We want to isolate China. And it's also probably going to incorporate, as it's not a coincidence that South Korea, Japan, and other countries have been included on these trips, right? Because they're all going to try to coordinate. South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, they're all going to try to make these countries coordinate a way to cut off China from this industry, to basically strangle it with an economic noose. It's not going to work because, one, China's market is so important to these countries, Taiwan not being a country, but it's so important to Taiwan and these other countries that it would be suicidal to try this. Now, I'm not saying that the DPP won't do something dumb. I think the DPP is the most likely to make a very rash move economically in these negotiations, and China will bear down consequences for this, of course, because this is a violation of sovereignty. But Japan, South Korea, some of these other countries, I think, are going to have a harder time negotiating this economic encirclement to complement the military encirclement of China, because China's market is so diverse. China's trade relationships with South Korea, Japan, and others in the region, right? It is the biggest trade partner of all of Asia, and these countries especially. China can bear down consequences, and it would be well within its right, because this is not quote unquote fair competition. This is militarizing the economic realm. This is economic imperialism. It's about strangling China economically so that it cannot advance its production objectives, its economic goals. It's all about containing and weakening China. So that is what we can expect this fall, if and when the Taiwan Authority meets with the trade representative and other stakeholders of Washington to start to outline what this economic partnership, this new economic partnership for the 21st century is going to look like. It's really just another instance of war. I mean, that's the big update, though. That is what's happening. And it's not like we can expect that somehow this is going to replace the military side of this. I think that the Biden administration, the Democrats, are going to continue to escalate with China on that realm as well, because there's some midterm elections coming up in less than 3 months. You know, November's right around the corner, and they're going to want to solidify, the Democrats, their anti-China, tough on China stance. So even just that immediate concern alone should help us understand that things are likely to continue to escalate unless there's pressure for them not to. But we just don't have that right now. We don't have a lot of people out on the street saying no war with China, right? And that's the big problem that we face. We face a problem with this propaganda, these imperialists' ventures being normalized and sanitized to the point that people don't really understand what's going on. Either they don't find it important, or they literally think that what their government is telling them and what their corporate media is telling them is true. But of course, we know that this is all lies, that the United States is trying to create a neo-colony within China, Taiwan, and use Taiwan to both launch a military operation within its new Cold War, the pivot to Asia, the encirclement of China, etc. That's been happening since 2012. And now economically, right, stripping Taiwan of its Chinese market, right, of its mainland Chinese market. That's what is going to happen. And it very well could create, it's going to create shockwaves to Taiwan, because China has already toughened its stance, economic stance toward Taiwan. But the CHIPS Act is going to ask for outsourcing and may lead to actually a weakening of Taiwan's economy, because the United States is not a trustworthy partner. It's going to ask this company, the TMSC, to cash out which means it will lose a lot. I mean, what has outsourcing done in the United States? It's made things more precarious for people. And whenever there's an increase of precarity under capitalism, there's also an increasing risk of economic crisis, right? Those two things go together. The more that workers struggle, the more that people struggle economically under capitalism, the more that capitalism builds the conditions for economic crisis. And so that's likely to happen in Taiwan once this CHIPS Act, these negotiations, this shift occurs. It's hard to know how fast it will occur, though, because of these consequences. The United States cannot afford Taiwan being placed in economic crisis because that's going to make the Taiwan Authority, that alone will make it understand that it needs the mainland market. It needs the mainland economy. So that's going to strengthen one China. And on the other hand, the United States can't be made to look like a fool before elections or even right after elections. Can't be made to look like a fool when it very well knows that despite these subsidies, the United States is not going to invest heavily in production in the United States. That's a pipe dream. Now, that's not even a dream. That's just a lie. U.S. investors, I've been saying this on every single program that I've been on talking about this issue. U.S. investors have for decades not wanted to invest in production. And why is that? Because not only do you need more than just these government subsidies, which they pocket, they pocket government subsidies for their own shareholders, bondholders, etc. But you not only need government investment, which goes antithetical to their plans for austerity, but then the corporations themselves, in the absence of the government investment, now need to place a whole lot of capital on the table to jumpstart production. That's how production works. You need to put down the costs that it takes. You can't, the buildings, the machinery, all that stuff doesn't pay for itself, right? You need to get that from somewhere. You need to, that's what workers are not the only cost that comes with production, even though they are the biggest, if not the principal source of profit. So this is going to be very interesting. But this is the Taiwan update. Taiwan update is that the economic warfare is going to escalate starting in this fall, supposedly, leading up to the election. And the consequences are likely to be pretty significant. So with that said, everyone, that's the update with Taiwan. I think I'll leave. I had the Substack article. So I don't see any super chats just yet. So I can get into the Substack article because I want to share it with all of you. So, and I will answer questions maybe if I have time after that. We're getting close to the hour and a half. So keep liking the video. Keep subscribing to the channel. I'm very close to 20,000, which will be a very nice milestone to hit. The growth has been a little slower than others because of a lot of reasons, probably. A lot of reasons, but I think it's been very steady in picking up. So with that said, though, subscribe to the channel if you're new here. Hit that notifications bell so you know when I'm going live. And subscribe to my Patreon at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong, or my Substack for annual contributions is fine too. That's the best way to support this work. So, here's the deal. I could talk about this, might deserve its own episode. So I don't have any Patreon questions. With that said, though, I would like to share quickly my article on why mental health is a class issue as part of my Ghost Stories of Capitalism series. And then if I have time, I'll get to questions. There may not be time, but if there's a super chat there, I don't see any right now, but if there is, I'll try to oblige before I head out. So where is my Substack? There it is. I want to go all the way to the top. All right. So yeah, this is not as much of a specific story as it is about, it's about an issue. But this article that I'm writing, and the next one I'm going to write about racism particularly against Black people, and how I came to learn about that. How I came to learn about how the United States is organized to oppress and exploit and murder Black people throughout my life. How I came into direct experience with that, with people both close and adjacent to me, to understand that. And then how I came to then make that a principle, a part of my politics. That's the plan I have for the next one, just swirling in my head. But this one talks about mental health. And I'll tell you why I wrote this. I was having an incredibly hard week that week. Just like personal stuff. I thought construction was starting this week near my bit right next door to me. I was doing some organizing, and then found out 1 to 2 months it's going to start, leading into the colder season. And so I had all kinds of mixed feelings about that. And then, there's some personal stuff. My dog got sick. I'm adjusting to this new schedule. Other things happened along the way. Oh, I had to figure out some. So if you know what it's like to be a content creator or to like do independent media, this is something I underestimated. There's a lot of stress that comes with being self-employed. And so I have been working on getting my tax situation in order for this coming season, which will be a big, let's just say, big payout to the IRS, and then to figure that out from here on forward. So just a lot of stress about these things. And there was more than that, but, I had some tough therapy sessions with clients, and, just like it can just pile up. You know what I'm saying? So I had a tough weekend. I was like, all right, I'm going to write about this. I'm going to write about mental health because it's an important issue for me. I do it professionally. I do it politically. I think about it politically. It's part of my overall personal experience. So ghost stories of capitalism, mental health is a class issue. We can't fight capitalism or imperialism without confronting the psychic suffering that these systems have spread far and wide among us. And one of my favorite memes is this: feeling sad and depressed, or you're anxious, worried about the future, feeling isolated, alone, you may be suffering from capitalism. And then symptoms, right? Homelessness, unemployment, poverty, hunger, feelings of powerless, apathy, boredom, cultural decay, loss of identity, extreme self-consciousness, loss of free speech, incarceration, suicidal or revolutionary thoughts, death. And suicidal is spelled wrong there, but nonetheless, we can't be perfect. Perfectionism is a symptom of anxiety. All right. So in a symptom of a pathological society, capitalism, imperialism, not pathological people. So I'm just going to read through this. It's a short one. It's not too bad. So I said, in addition to producing socialist and anti-imperialist independent media, I've been in social work for 9 years. Before this, I moved from childhood to adulthood within a household that struggled with mental illness. Memories from this period aren't all quote unquote bad or negative. However, for those who struggle with any number of mental health disorders, it is not uncommon for the brain to place intense focus on those memories associated with the stuff made of ghosts and horror stories. Unlike movies, the suffering embedded in humanity's traumatic memories rarely gets the collective attention it deserves. Here are just a few of mine. So these are interesting. These deserve long stories. I'm not going to get into long stories of it, but, I talked about pleading to my mom to stop running the sink because she has a really bad OCD, so that I could get some rest in our tiny apartment before my SAT exams. I got like 0 sleep during my SAT exams because we lived in this very tiny apartment. No matter if she was in the bedroom, which was in the bedroom next to mine, or a bathroom, which was in the bedroom next to mine, or whether she was in the kitchenette thing, which was literally like right next to my bed, it didn't matter. It was just noisy. Like the sound of a sink is super annoying to try to go to bed to. So I remember just being very awake, and I did not sleep well before my SATs, and I did a lot worse than I thought I was going to do. Well, here's the thing. I also had I just had anxiety taking standardized tests. That's a very common thing, but couple that on with the lack of sleep, and I was just a mess. And so the nausea before each and every high school basketball game, feeling as though the weight of the world was sitting on my chest and stomach. Basketball was a huge important part of my childhood. And I put a lot of pressure on myself. There's a lot of pressure on me. I thought I was gonna be some big shot. I was like a semi shot. Like, I wouldn't call myself big or small within the high school basketball realm, but I was pretty good. And I put a lot of pressure on myself to be good. And the performance anxiety was ridiculous. I just remember before games, just like feeling, it wasn't like I was puking or anything like that, but I was just heaving, like this dry cough, which I still get when I get incredibly stressed or have like something I'm like worrying about, anxiety, but nothing to the level of what would happen before my high school basketball games. And so equally vivid is the memory of the hoarding neighbor in the apartment below threatening my mother with violence when I was a preteen, and my father coming home with visible bruises and cuts after being jumped by gangsters on the block years before that. So yeah, we had this hoarder is the term that mental health practitioners use now, but we had we had a person living downstairs from us who was hoarding. My mother ended up befriending him somewhat, and then not really, but then he became friends with my mom's friend who lived upstairs, who was also had mental, like he had a lot of his own struggles. Then he started to get exploited by the hoarder. This guy who lived upstairs started to get exploited by him, because one thing about hoarding is that it becomes like an organizing principle. And the way this guy treated it was like a business. So he would like employ my mom's other friend to basically do his bidding. It was a mess. But I remember one night I woke up and I don't even know if I was asleep yet, actually. But she was upstairs with her friend. And then I heard him walk up the stairs and I heard him yelling at the top of his lungs. I was like, oh, fuck no. Like, regardless of how annoying my mom, how like frustrated I was with her often, I was like, no, like I am not, that just felt bad. And my dad, I think, was working late that night. So I went up there and it was a mess. Like I was like, what, 13, 14, being like, I was like, it was crazy. So that's just some of the things. And then my dad got in a fight. I was like 5 at this time or something before I went to school. And my father had a lot of anger, and we had some unsavory people on our block, certainly. A couple of we had a couple of these white families, big white poor families. Some of them got into things, acted obnoxiously, often intoxicated. And my dad was one of these guys that just like, when he got angry with people, he got really angry. And so one time I think they like sliced his tires or key scratched his car, or both. I forget which one. Then my dad did the same thing. And then my dad got jumped by them. And that was actually scary. So anyway, so I talk about this is rooted in a family history of mental illness. My father bore depressive scars of trauma from being raised by a mother who struggled with an addiction to alcohol throughout his childhood, economic insecurity, and being drafted to invade Vietnam on behalf of genocidal U.S. imperialists didn't help matters either. So his mental health was poorer because of these things as well. My mother's mental health conditions were even more severe than my father's. She has undiagnosed bipolar and obsessive compulsive disorder, which created innumerable barriers to a stereotypical mother-child relationship under capitalism and fueled toxic stress in the home. So this is, I think, important for those of you who are children of mental illness or have family, caretakers, caregivers with mental health. It's like, it's confusing when you're young. You're young, you feel it's very alienating. There's a lot more questions than answers. And then there's a lot of stigma with it. So you want to hide, right? You don't want to show this. I remember not wanting to show my friends, my mother, especially. My dad was a little embarrassing because he was one of these kind of like, while he was a hard ass, he was also kind of like a lovey-dovey type. So that was also very uncomfortable growing up as like a boy with these like hyper emasculated, like masculine kids, just like constantly, making fun of stuff like that. So he had this like side to him as well. So I was a little embarrassed by him, but I was a lot more embarrassed, right? Just like, ashamed of my mom. I was just like, no, I do not want my friends to meet her, And so, yeah, with that stigma, though, like, we don't want help. We don't want to talk about this. We just want to be normal. We want to live a normal life and hope over time that, these obstacles will be surpassed from our efforts, right? And oftentimes what happens is that kids will I did it with basketball, will put an incredible amount of effort into something, right? Into something. That's the resilience model that I criticize, because I think resiliency can be a very damaging concept for working class and oppressed people, it can almost fetishize this like overcoming narrative, like we've overcome oppression and exploitation, and that can be its own kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps narrative, which creates even more mental health problems, unsurprisingly. So it wasn't until I entered adulthood that I mastered intellectualization, which is kind of how I first express feelings these days, and channeled this into the struggle against capitalism and imperialism. By the time I was 23, I firmly believed that mental health conditions were a byproduct of exploitation, class rule, white supremacy, and violence. And the violence of imperial society formed the roots of so-called psychic, quote-unquote, pathology. I still believe this. Indeed, the evidence is profound. So here are just some facts. 1 in 5 people in the United States have been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, and many more live with undiagnosed conditions. The United States leads the world in the number of people taking antidepressant medications, or SSRIs, or NIs, which are prescribed for a variety of mental health disorders, from major depressive disorder to generalized anxiety disorder. The prevalence of mental illness in the U.S. has been going up by at least 1% annually, with rates of depression in the U.S. having gone up 50 to 60% over the decade from 2005 to 2017. And here's my tweet about it. We're number one. The United States is number one. The picture, I don't know why the picture, where's the picture showing up? The picture cuts it off. It's down there. But the United States is below Australia, all the way over here. So number one. All right. And so the reasons for this are many. Economic insecurity in the age of neoliberalism has been coupled with the eradication of public and collective institutions of any kind. So yeah, as people have gotten poorer, one of the things that is not often talked about is that as you are become more and more exploited, these collective institutions like unions or even social organizations, any kind of organization, goes away, because not only are these threats, especially unions, organized labor, but organized communities are also a threat. So a lot of public institutions, austerity takes these things away from us, right? It takes away our meeting spaces. It closes our public schools. It replaces public spaces with private spaces that you need to pay to play in. So that's something that is not talked about too often, but I think is a big reason why people have a hard time connecting, right? Have a hard time connecting in this period. So then you have the steady increases in homelessness, healthcare debt, student loan debt, inflation, low-wage employment, long-term employment, all being major risk factors for toxic stress and a decline in mental health. The U.S. is also a racist and repressive society that incarcerates more than 2 million people, 25% of the world's total, and regularly targets Black Americans and other oppressed nations for police brutality and discrimination. Endless war, individualism, and corporate media propaganda only add to the stress of living in an empire in decline that is rotting from within. I was talking to my client about this because he was talking about what it is like and what it was like growing up as a Black male. And, he was telling me a story about how, like white women would run away from him. Like he's had experiences where he would just be existing in a space and there would be flight. And I told him about, when I was with one of my friends who actually was killed at the age of 17 by an unfortunate accidental shooting. He's Haitian, very Black, and no confusing that in this racist society. So we were just talking outside of my home. There's like this little gated area, and I was standing behind this like half gate, and he was standing on the other side on the sidewalk. And we were just talking before we would depart. It was later at night. It was probably like 9 when we would 9:30. We generally end playing basketball, go home. And I remember, there was this white woman walking by, and we're just talking. We're not even paying attention to her. But then she books it as fast as she can. And we're just watching her. Like, why is she doing that? And, we thought about it, and we both kind of were like, is she scared of us, you? And, he thought it was him, And so, anyway, that's what I mean by regularly targeting Black Americans. This whole society is organized to breed that fear to justify the repression. That's why 40% of prisoners in the United States are Black Americans, 70% Indigenous, Latino, Black, etc. Endless war, individualism, and corporate media propaganda only add to the stress of living an entire decline that is rotting from within, with these conditions creating widespread fear, anger, confusion, and isolation. Communities are dismembered, despair is commonplace, the ruling class stigmatizes mental anguish and suffering because it reflects understandable reactions to the pain that its system has imposed on the majority of the people. I want you, if you learn anything from this, to understand mental health conditions like that. That any media portrayal of crazy people, quote unquote, committing heinous acts of antisociality, that's ingrained in our minds, that we're supposed to believe mental illness is synonymous with violence and danger, which of course is not true. But anytime there's a mass shooting, I hate this. Anytime there's a mass shooting, what do we hear? Oh, were they mentally ill? Like, I just said 1 in 5 people have a mental health diagnosis that's known, right? 1 in 5 people, whether it's they're formally diagnosed or they're informally diagnosed, they identify, doesn't matter. 1 in 5 people experience, they say, I have depression, I have anxiety, I have PTSD, I have, whatever it is, schizophrenia, schizoaffective, whatever it is, bipolar disorder. 1 in 5 people have something that they identify with. So, do 1 in 5 people commit mass shootings? Absolutely not. It's a completely spurious connection. Like, correlation does not always equal causation. And it's just important to understand that that's a real media-driven narrative to get us to simply explain much more complex phenomena that have to do with the system. And so social control is paramount for an increasingly unstable system of exploitation. This is why the U.S. punishes mental health far more than it invests in treatment. U.S. prisons are stuffed to the brim with poor people suffering from serious mental health conditions, which are called SMI, bipolar disorders, psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, things like that. Police regularly gun down and murder people from suffering from acute mental distress. State violence and mass incarceration not only increases mental health risks, but also sends a powerful message to the suffering that punishment is far more likely to be meted out than compassion. And then I cite this from Prison Policy Initiative. 1 in half of people in state prisons report mental health problems, but only 1 in 4 have received professional help. So 56% has any recent or prior history of mental health problems. This is in state prisons, and this is the treatment received. So 56%, I mean, that's a huge, that's over 1 million people within U.S. prisons saying struggling with mental illness or had it and still struggling with it, right? Got it in prison, or, usually it's some combination of the two. Social movements are not immune from the U.S.'s punitive and stigmatizing approach to mental health. Decades of government infiltration has spread sectarianism, stifled collective organization, divided the left, and brought countless organizations and leaders to fight amongst themselves rather than against the class enemy. The truth is that we come into movement activism for a reason. Many times, it's the weight of oppression and exploitation that drives us into seeking out collective action. And in too many instances, it's the disappointment and the hurt that we experience from others engaged in the same cause that risks discouragement to the point of isolation. So I've experienced this in many different activist endeavors. I've just it's just like a day-to-day thing. You see the anguish that people in the movement have. That so many of us who are involved in politics have our own particular issues, and usually it's not addressed. And this history of subversion, the way that it's affected our mental health as well, the way it's bred this sectarianism, this division amongst us, the anti-communism, and just the ways of relating that can be very, very cop-like, very much, I've just experienced this so many times where there isn't attention to relationships. And what happens is that people just do the work. Leaders form organically. Those leaders probably shouldn't be in the position that they're in. And then all hell breaks loose, right? People are hurt. There's a lot of painful stuff that's happening. I know many organizations recently, even just in the last few years, have splintered, have become smaller. And it's a real shame. It's a real shame. And it just in my experience in media too, the passive communication, the lack of communication, the lack of cooperation the number of emails and messages that I have that have gone unanswered, that sends a particular kind of message like, what's going on? You got a problem with me politically? You can't just say no to me. Like things like that. That kind of communication is so toxic, but it's all over the movement. And you know what? The best of us are guilty of this, including myself. The best of us are guilty of this. And we do have to own up to that in left circles, socialist circles, etc. So isolation among the people has increased exponentially due to the COVID-19 pandemic and all the economic and social dislocation caused by the capitalist class's prioritization of profits over human need. With isolation comes a heightened sense of danger. When this heightened sense of danger has nowhere to go, it comes out in ways that can go unnoticed to the naked eye. Political and emotional discontent has been channeled to deep divides over COVID-19 and partisan politics, leaving as little room as possible for workers and oppressed people to collectively experience their suffering and come together to fight the ruling class responsible for it. So yeah, that's what it is. I believe all COVID-19, the divisions over it, I believe that the partisan squabbling, which even the best of us are just so obsessed with. I feel like most independent media, this is my big critique of all independent media, is that we are obsessed with partisanship, that we are looking at what people are doing in a partisan manner. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be looking at electoral trends, that we shouldn't be seeing where people are at, because most people politically are just looking at elections, sure. But it also means that we can fall into the trap of trying to harness that misattention, that misinformation for our benefit, and it can do a lot of damage. I mean, I think the way that there's just been a lot of I've received messages for this. I received a message on Telegram calling me a monster for supposedly supporting strict COVID-19 measures, and I still say that I do, but without any clarity, right? I have supported that. Of course I did, because I looked at what China did and I said we should be doing something similar to get control of this thing. I still believe that. Now, of course, conditions have changed. We're more in an unfortunate endemic scenario. So, maybe I don't think my opinion would change on what we need to do about it, a comprehensive public health response. But nonetheless, to call someone a monster for disagreeing and then huffing off and rushing out. I've had so many people on Patreon do that so strangely. It's like, oh, you don't agree with me on this one thing. And this thing is the most important in the world. So I got to go. What is that? What is that? If I did that for everybody who didn't agree with me 100% about imperialism or China or socialism, I would have literally zero connections to anybody except for a select few people. I wouldn't be talking to any of you right now. I wouldn't be talking to anybody because I wouldn't have talked to Kim Iverson. We don't agree on everything about China, but I still talk to her. I didn't go to her. I didn't go on her program and say, oh, you said this thing in our program. I didn't like it. What is that? What is that behavior? That's amateurish, very immature behavior, but it's rooted, I think, in mental illness, in the ways that people have reacted to the trauma of these last few years and a half, which has nothing to do with anybody's support or non-support for policies. It's not about the public. The public has been divided based upon partisan politics in the way that a major event, a life-altering event, a politically and economically earth-shattering event like a pandemic, that's what is responsible. The ways in which the ruling class reacted to it to create this psychological chaos on top of the system chaos. So we can't run from mental health any more than we can run from the class struggle. The two are inextricably bound together. The mind needs nourishment just as much as we need food, water, housing, living wage employment, healthcare, education, and peace. Any kind of collective action for liberation must include attention to the mental health condition of those engaged in it. Unfortunately, neoliberal models of self-care that focus primarily on corporate consumption and individual uplift are woefully inadequate at best or reproduce relations of exploitation at worst. Building a revolutionary movement isn't therapy, but it can be therapeutic. Movements that shy away from the realities of the people they seek to lead are not sustainable. Mental anguish is easily weaponized by our corporate overlords when it is drowned in obscurity. People join movements and seek mental health treatment for similar reasons, to end suffering and to improve their lives in tangible ways. Ignoring the mental health of the movement is just as damaging as whistling past key issues such as race and class and the struggle for peace, justice, and socialism. Building movements and ending centuries-long systems of oppression is hard on the mind and body. It wouldn't be called a struggle if it were easy. The only way we can sustain this work and give ourselves to the cause of liberation is to actively care for each other and confront the stigma preventing far too many from asking for help. While therapy in the broad mental health system is woefully inadequate and often oppressive, treatment should not be discouraged and discussion about mental health should be open. It is imperative that we develop institutions of community care within our movements to sustain activity in the people engaged in it. I say it won't be perfect. There will be hiccups. Mental illness is a symptom of a much broader disease of capitalism. Only socialist revolution can begin to provide a true cure for the stamps of suffering imposed upon the workers and oppressed of the world. Few will want to fight for a revolution that renders key parts of the class experience under imperialism invisible. This makes the development of relationships to sustain the organization required for such a revolution imperative, and addressing the mental health crises produced by our class enemies' ceaseless exploitation and violence a must. So here's what I propose. All right. Begin by checking on how our strong friends, quote unquote, and comrades are doing today. Make a concerted effort to balance our striving to understand and combat the existing capitalist system of exploitation with the development of relationships and institutions, however rudimentary, that help us truly get to know those who we stand with and for in the arduous struggle for a socialist revolution. So that's my take. I'm going to put this in the chat so you can subscribe if you want. You can do an annual subscription, free if you follow it. So, that's my article on why mental health is a class issue. Just my musings, with some storytelling in there, but a lot of it is just, my thoughts on this topic, why it has to do with class struggle, and how we should be talking about it. We need to be talking about this issue as something that's open. I'm sick and tired. I'm getting too old for this. I'm getting too old for, what happens where we whistle past these things, where, we don't even try to get to know each other. We just do the work. There's like this workhorse syndrome in the United States. We just do the work, but there's no attention to, do you know these folks? Do you what is your accountability to the people you're moving with? It's hard for me to get down with that kind of stuff anymore after this pandemic moment and all that's transpired in the last 2.5 years. I've had just my share of experiences even before that, honestly, since 2011, all the way into 2020. I was already tired, because I had cycled through organizations and felt and tried my own and just felt like, there's just so much stuff that, so much baggage, so much that we need to work through together. And the only way we can do that is by openly talking about this and talking about the consequences of this and building real relationships and institutions that can help us sustain this work and make it more, won't always be doable, because this is not necessarily doable kind of work most of the time, but to just make it more tolerable. And people think that's a bad word. I've had this conversation with so many of my clients. The idea of tolerance, not tolerance to oppression, not accepting oppression, exploitation, but tolerating the existence of these things, tolerating the fact that we are in a situation where we are trying to survive. What did the Panthers say? Survival pending revolution. That's kind of the way that I think we need to treat mental health as well. People need to not just survive with food and housing, but the conditions of alienation and exploitation also cause immense psychic suffering, which means we need to be able to help people survive and even stabilize enough so they can both be involved and they can also have a modicum of well-being as they're trying to move toward a better world and toward fighting for a system that will get us that. And I think it's oftentimes underestimated that we don't actually make much progress when people are spiraling and in decline, where people are suffering from austerity and massive amounts of toxic stress. Most times you're not going to get people to join in the movement in those conditions. Like, I mean, I got pushed into politics from that sort of thing, but certainly it was me building up a kind of way of coping with it over my early adult years that allowed me to increase my level of activity. It wasn't my suffering, because when I'm in periods of suffering now, I I still feel like I can't do this sometimes, right? Like, we all have those moments. I can't do this. And so we have to be honest about that. And we have to be honest that that's a real experience that people have just in movement politics and in their lives. So, yeah, keep liking the video, everyone. We are coming toward the end. That's going to be the end of my talk on the mental health piece. It went way over. We're about 15 minutes over. So I should wrap up. So like the video, hit that notifications bell, subscribe button. Make sure that you are also, if you can, right? I put my Substack, the link in the chat. But my Substack is also in the video description. So you can do an annual membership there if you'd like. Patreon is still the place I do promote the most. You can go patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. My link tree is down there. So be sure to follow Telegram and all of those good things. But with that said, though, is there any I don't think I have time for any questions, but I'll just go through some of this chat because I saw you guys were talking, and I think that this is yeah, I think this is an important topic. So if you want to hang with me for another 5 minutes, I don't see any super chats. So yeah, so not this game. Should all be grateful to say what we want. Ugh. Get me started with those folks. Yeah, there's plenty of people scared in our movement for even saying China, let alone or Russia, let alone taking an oppositional stance to NATO. So much for free speech. So, all right. I'm just looking at some of these chat conversations. Suicides on the rise in the United States. Yes, they are. Mental illness is only considered when the shooter is white. This is true. So yeah, we hear about mental illness when. So it's like a double bind, right? It's like a double whammy for you. So you have this idea that mental health is causing people to shoot other people primarily. And look, homicidal ideation, yeah, and intent, yeah, that usually stems from some kind of mental health crisis, but it's not the cause necessarily. And then when it's only considered with white people, yeah, because of course with black people it's just criminals, right? Criminality. And also black people don't commit mass shootings in the United States like like our white American counterparts. So there's something to be said about that, right? It's hard to refabricate, so it's best to understand. Forget. Yeah, like I think I saw the comment about crazy. Yeah, like I think using that word isn't necessarily offensive. I also think that the media does it in a certain kind of way. So when we're just, and then that's how we learn this language. So we shouldn't be so focused on the language per se, but I definitely see where you're coming from. Support prisoners by writing to them, sending them money for toiletries and books. Yes, please do. Please write to prisoners It comes from the top. All these mofos are sociopaths. That is true. Yes. Learn more about political prisoners at Jericho Movement. Yes, please do. JerichoMovement.com has a list of political prisoners, their addresses. You can write letters to them, their websites, their campaigns. I know Jericho does their own campaigns as well, but they usually are doing work with those forces, with the individual, with the prisoners themselves. Albert Woodfox, rest in power. I didn't even get a chance to finish his book. I would have loved to have him on. What a people's hero he was. 40 plus years in solitary confinement. That's torture. He was tortured for 40 plus years for his political activity. Anyway. So I'm not going to comment on the Caleb Maupin situation. There is a Medium piece going around. I did see it. This is what I'm talking about, guys. If you see it, I think my article can kind of explain where I come from with it. So let's see. Oh, I see a super chat. So Connie, there's an article on Medium going around. You can read that. Twitter's talking about it. I know Xiang Yu posted about it. I'm not going to comment on it, though, because I feel like it would be a lot of energy, and it's one of these things that I think my article can explain, but you can definitely find it. Thank you, Big Teal. I try to be, and Connie, I appreciate that. I remember somebody said, you're like Brianna Joy Gray, way too calm, cool, and composed. And I'm like, I'm more of a Jimmy Dore. I'm like, why is this a thing? Like, learn. Like, forget about, you know what I'm saying? Like, give me a break. Like, most media is, it's hard. It's hard for me to be like, oh, come on, let's be real. So I appreciate this. Yes, the infighting on the left can be very depressing. Definitely. Oh man, one thing. It's the things I could say about that, but I'm gonna keep it. I'm gonna keep it principled here. I don't expect to agree 100%, but some disagreements are deal breakers. Oh yeah, for sure. And I have deal breakers for me. Here's the thing about this, though, is that for me, yes, there are deal breaking disagreements, but there's also kind of like bigger objectives in our movement that I think we need to sometimes, right? Like, I'm not saying we collaborate with forces that are diametrically and opposed to us and like literally looking to destroy us. But I do think, especially in media, it can be tough for me when there's such a blackout of the things I talk about, that when people who I may not disagree with on everything, and some of those disagreements I may say like in a different context, yeah, that's a deal breaker. Like, if I were to, for example, if I were to have to like debate free speech with someone who is like a free speech hawk and they're like, and they think America is free, or like some like racist idiot, whatever, like whoever you might have in your head about that. If I were to have to like talk to them, most of the time what happens anyway is that they don't even want to talk about the issues I want to talk about. So the deal's already broken. But if there's someone who's genuinely trying to understand an issue and also be on the right side of it, and somebody asks me to then talk about that issue, then it's hard for me to say, well, okay, that person thinks like X on this other thing. I can't speak to them. So it can be complex for me, for sure. It can be complex. It's definitely a more complicated question than we make it out to be. And I've had arguments with people close to me about this. I can tell you not everyone agrees with how I do things. So anyway, I don't see any more questions, but let me somebody asking I copy that article to my website. Yeah, go right ahead, Raul. right ahead. Anyone who wants to share my Substack article, put the link on the Substack if you can. Anyone who shares it on their own websites and stuff, that's fine. As long as you link to the original source, just so people know that it was not I didn't publish it on your site. That's it. More than musings, comrade. Yeah, you're right. Thanks, Big Teal. Let's see. All right. We're getting to the end here. Mental health is important. Thanks, Lewis. Yes, it is. Thanks for sharing your experience. You're very welcome. I'm so grateful for today. We're healing together. Hey, if I can help with someone's process, I would love that. And thanks, Big Teal, for sharing my Twitter. Also, my Telegram at the Dhaiphong Press. I'll share that now. I keep losing. I don't know if people are leaving Telegram or people just leave me because they disagree with my politics, but here it is again. Definitely hit up my Telegram. So let's see what this okay, so thanks for the super sticker, Kathy Lloyd. No question there. So I'll just keep going. Advice, reconciliation, attempted or successful rapists, abusers, stalkers, or profit. Ooh. Oh, I don't know your situation. I don't think. Do you have any advice for reconciliation with attempted? You know, that's a tough one for me. That's a really tough one. I don't know. And the reason why I say it like that is because I think it'll depend on the kind of boundaries that you'd like to set with these folks. I think these are hard choices to make, and it's a big question. Big question. But I think you kind of just, I don't think there are any right answers, and so some of it is like experimenting with boundaries / seeing how that goes, and if it doesn't work, then trying to find places where you can be supported in that, because some people are kind of like forced. Some people don't have a choice. Some people can't, they can't separate. So I don't know the situation exactly, but if there's a choice there, you feel, then I think you can experiment and see what you tolerate. But I would definitely seek out, if you do have any ability to get further help with that situation, I would do that. Julian Assange, thanks for this. Again, thanks for the super sticker. And then, all right. Okay. All right, everyone. I should go. Oh, man. What's this? It's already deleted, I hope. Thanks, Kelly, for the super sticker. Thanks, Sean. All right, guys. I'm out of here. All right. Take good care. And I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.